All right, welcome. For those who came in after I explained last time, my name is Dr. Hall. I'm filling in for Dr. Kalin today. She is actually out sick today, but as fate had it, she asked me to come give this guest lecture today anyway, so that sort of works well for her. You've all turned in your papers. If anybody comes in late, remind me to ask them to turn in their papers. The question that we are going to tackle today, as you may have seen from the syllabus, is about sign language. But I want to situate that in the broader context of this question of what is human language in general. And I wonder if you guys have come up with a sort of working definition in the class so far? Is it something that you've sort of sat down and done? Okay. Well, as a first pass definition, I wonder what you think of this as a working definition. So maybe what it means to be a language is to be a symbolic communication system used by a human community that involves both meaningful and meaningless elements and conventions for combining them. That sound pretty reasonable? Okay. So by that definition, what about something like HTML? We call it a language. Does it pass the test? Yeah.
To someone who can read it, yeah.
To someone who can read it, sure. All right, but does French pass the test for someone who can't read French? No.
Well, it communicates an idea. As long as you can understand it, then it can qualify as a language like to an individual.
Okay, great. So as long as somebody has familiar with language, so someone who programs HTML or somebody who speaks French, then they can understand it, maybe that counts. And it has maybe meaningful and meaningless elements, okay, and conventions for combining them, sure. How about music? Music notation. Yeah.
I would say there's definitely like symbols in their own, like language in the sense that you need to understand it before you can like actually read it or something like that. But I feel like it's different versus the language we are speaking now because like I was gonna say more of an communication, but music is kind of a communication as well with communicating what symbols represent sounds and stuff like that. I don't know.
Okay. Well, no, this is a good intuitions to bring into the discussion. So there's some sense in which maybe music is meaningful, maybe it's communicative, but yet maybe it's distinct from the kinds of language that we have. Yeah?
I think it's more like abstract, like it's better at communicating like emotions than it would be like a thought.
Okay, sure. So maybe there's greater expressive power in what we think of as language than music.
Yeah, I agree. I think the music, the symbols, it expresses the notes, but it doesn't express anything beyond musical notes. Whereas a language that has words, you can express abstract ideas that aren't necessarily just the word.
Great, great. Okay. How about then something like charades?
Charades.
Does it pass the test? Yeah.
It conveys an idea. That's pretty much like the extent of charades.
Okay.
You could have a conversation, but you need to have something to like base it off of that's common knowledge already.
So do we feel like these are systems that we want to call language in every sense that we would call English or French or Urdu a language? And yet they're doing pretty well at passing our tests. So maybe we should think about refining those definitions as we then get to the question of sign language. Do we have intuition? So sign language would probably pass this test, right? But so do these other systems that we might not want to consider as really having all the properties of human language. So maybe our first pass working definition isn't going to cut it. So fortunately for us, other researchers have created much more exhaustive proposals about what constitutes a language. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions on a human language to be, what are the properties that it needs to have? One of the most well-known and frequently studied proposals is by Charles Hockett from 1966, who proposed the following. This is a lot of stuff. We're not going to go through all of it. But if you are interested in digging into this a little bit more detail, it's really accessible stuff. Today, we're really just going to highlight these handful, what are they, 8 principles. And we're going to step through them one by one, talk about what they are, what Hockett meant by them, and then ask whether or not sign language as we know it passes those tests. Right? And we go today until 10:45. Great. So let's start with the following 3 design features of language. This was Hockett's proposal for the properties that every human language must have in order to be called a human language. So number 1, it's got to be vocal auditory channel. Spoken language is produced in the vocal tract and transmitted, heard as sound. Well, how's sign language doing on this front? Yeah?
Well, it seems that, it does say spoken language.
It does, but in fact, Hockett wrote that not even intending there to be a contrast between spoken and sign. Hockett wrote that as spoken language as in humanity, as opposed to written language, as opposed to music, as opposed to charades, as opposed to anything else. In 1966, some linguists were convinced by then that as holding a particular view of sign languages, but it actually was not at all clear-cut. So at least by this criterion, well, sign language is produced on the hands, perceived typically by the eyes, but also by the hands in the case of blind signers. But in no case is it vocal auditory. So minus mark there. His second criterion is broadcast transmission and directional reception. Quote, the audible sound of language is heard in all directions, but listeners will interpret it as coming from one specific direction. Right, which is why if you guys closed your eyes and I walked around the room and I continued to give this lecture, you would be able to hear me regardless of where I am in the room, but you would be able to perceive where I'm standing. Right? Whereas if I turn around, right, you couldn't tell what I said, but I could do this and you could still tell what I say. Right? So, how's sign language doing here? Nicht sehr gut. Sign language is only perceived by those who are looking, and in fact, this it doesn't take deaf children long to realize this when their moms are yelling at them. It's kind of cute and kind of really annoying. His fifth criterion, the third one that we're going to pick out to discuss today, total feedback. So individuals can hear and internalize a message that they have sent. Right? This is the simple observation that when I speak, you hear me, but I also hear me. Right? You also hear yourselves, although interestingly, we don't hear ourselves in the same way that other people hear us, which is why our voices always sound so weird on a voicemail or whatever. This is also the reason why if you're ever on a Skype call or a cell call with bad reception and you start hearing your own voice echo back to you, the reason that that freaks us out so much and it's so hard to keep talking is because of this total feedback. Now, when a signer is signing, they don't generally look at their own hands. Right? I don't sign like this, and there's a lot of places on the body like that. So if I sign father, I really can't look at like where the point of contact is. Signers may have somatosensory feedback, muscle feedback about what our hands are doing, but it is absolutely not the same signal that I see from my perspective as you see from your perspective. So once again, sign language definitely looks different to the signer, me, than it does to the addressee. So we're not off to such a hot start here. Sign language is failing the first 3 criteria that Hockett has proposed as necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be called a human sign language. And this may help explain why even as recently as 1966, people weren't completely on board with the idea of sign language as really being language, legit language. So let's keep going. Arbitrariness is this idea that there is no direct connection between the form of the signal and its meaning. Okay. So to illustrate this, did anybody speak Turkish? Good. What does this mean? Orange.
An orange.
An orange, all right, fair enough. Means student. How about kuzu? Wild guess. It means lamb. And bugün? You're gonna be wrong, it's okay, just guess something.
Frisbee.
Frisbee means tomorrow, right? So what this illustrates is that we, without knowing the system, as was pointed out before, the fact that these signals, their meanings are not guessable just by hearing their form, that illustrates the arbitrariness of spoken language, and in this case, Turkish. So let's now do the same thing with a few cases of sign. Who are my ASL signers in the room? Anybody? Nobody? Next semester. Okay. Well, if you don't know anything yet, it's okay. Everybody's allowed to play as long as you don't actually know ASL. That'd be like knowing Turkish, and then I wouldn't let you guess. All right. So see if you can guess the meaning of this sign. Cut, scissors, yes. In fact, it can mean both of those things. Good job. Okay, fine. How about this one? Hammer. Nice. 2 for 2. And how about this? Huh? Flute. 3 for 3. Well done. You guys are better at ASL than you are at Turkish. All right, well, let's keep going. So right now, actually, right where we are, do those signs look very arbitrary? Not so much. The opposite of arbitrariness is called iconicity. And the signs that we've seen so far, pretty iconic, right? You were pretty able to guess their meaning based on their form. So let's keep going. So for those who walked in, if you are ASL signers, you're not allowed to play. Okay, here we go. Guesses? Perfume? Nope. Cheese. Okay.
You have something on your nose.
You have something on your nose. It means doll. And
Headache.
lettuce. So, what am I trying to point out here? That there is both, precisely. That sign languages contain both arbitrariness and iconicity. So iconicity are these non-arbitrary connections between the signal and its meaning, like in those first 3 examples. But here's the thing, iconicity is not limited to sign language. In fact, iconicity also pervades spoken languages, potentially not to the same extent, and certainly within the field of generative linguistics, iconicity has been downplayed. There was a very influential linguist named de Saussure who sort of founded modern linguistics, and he very much viewed iconicity, cases like these onomatopoeia, he viewed these as very much as a peripheral phenomenon that's really kind of it's not a core property of language. But the more that we study this, the sort of bigger role we find that this may play in not just sign language, but spoken languages as well. Interestingly, so onomatopoeia is this big fat Greek word that refers to things like words that sound like what they mean, so bang, drip, drop, woof in English. And we might consider these highly iconic, but interestingly, the very same concepts in different languages are instantiated in slightly different ways. So, does anybody speak Greek or Korean? So bang in Greek is something like goop or kung in Korean. Drip drop is fits fits in Greek and tok tok in Korean. Right? You get the point. The same, what I want to stress here is that the same is true of iconic signs. So you may see an highly iconic ASL sign like tree. Like, oh, duh, okay, of course that's the sign for tree. How else would you do tree? Well, in Chinese Sign Language, this is the sign for tree. And in Danish Sign Language, it looks like this. So these are all different ways of iconically representing the meaning of tree, in the same way that these are different iconic ways of representing sounds. And there's probably going to be iconicity in spoken language mapping onto the way that things sound, and there's likely going to be iconicity in sign languages mapped onto the way that things look. Right? So, meanwhile, there are lots of arbitrary components, both to the iconic signs themselves, as well as elsewhere in the lexicon and in the grammar of the language. One other sort of fun fact to point out is that there is substantial arbitrariness across different sign languages. Right? So the very same signal, for example, this sign, which in American Sign Language means what, like he said what. In British Sign Language, it means where. The sign this, in ASL it's meaning, like what is the meaning of this? But in British Sign Language it means organized. And the sign this, which means right or correct in ASL, in British Sign Language that means talk. So again, these iconic and arbitrary mappings in both spoken and sign language. So I'm going to argue that sign languages pass the arbitrariness test, at least as much as spoken languages do. Discreteness is the next of Hockett's criteria, and this is the idea that each unit of communication can be separated and sort of uniquely identifiable, that you can break words down into component parts. So let me ask, I'm gonna show you a bunch of different words, English words, and your job is to figure out how many unique sounds there are in those words. And the way you're gonna sort of vote is you're gonna clap. So I'm gonna start counting 1, 2, 3, etc. up until pretty much everybody has clapped. And so clap after I get to the number of the sounds that matches how many sounds you think are in the word. Okay? So it's going to be like 1, clap, 2, clap. Yeah? Here you go. How many sounds in the word stop? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't hear many claps. We're going to try this again. Okay. How many sounds in the word stop? Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so there's a range of intuitions here. And I think the most claps I heard was for 4. There's also a big peek at 1. So stop has 1 syllable, stop. But we can maybe break that syllable down into smaller units. So we might have one unit that is stop, and then a unit that's maybe is one way to break it down. Or we could break it down even smaller. And in fact, when we look at the component parts of this, we can find a sound for s, t, a, p. So here, this is an example where one sound corresponds to one letter. But again, the goal here is to count not the letters, but the sounds. So let's try another example. How many different sounds in the word thought? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Okay, vote. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, good. The answer is 3. It's a big long word, lots of letters, but when we break it down into its sound structure, there's a f, there's an ah, and there's a t. That's all there is. Okay, we'll do one more. How many sounds in the word 6? Some time to think. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good. 4. So there's only 3 letters here, but there's actually 4 sounds. S, I, k, s. Right? So this level of sound structure, this is what discreteness is talking about. Words in all spoken languages are built out of small bits of sound, and those bits are called phonemes. There's more to the definition of a phoneme than just this. But for our present purposes, the point is that we can decompose these meaningful units into these smaller units And the question is whether that is also possible for signs. So right away we run into a problem, given that words unfold over time in this sort of nice linear fashion. But when you were seeing those examples of signs earlier, something like lettuce, doll, there's a lot of simultaneity there. There's not a whole lot of structure, or linear sequence, unless you want to say that like the first time you do this and the second time you do this. It's kind of all there is. So for a long time, this was one of the reasons why linguists didn't really take sign languages seriously as full languages. But a very smart linguist, actually he wasn't really a linguist, he was an English professor, embarrassment to our field. He realized that it was possible to break single signs down into smaller units, the same way that we broke those spoken words down into smaller units. And he noticed that you could describe signs with respect to these 4 kinds of parameters. So you could look at the shape of the hand, the kind of the fingers involved. So, for example, we can have a sign red, and we can have a sign cute, that are very similar except that their hand shape changes. Similarly, we can look at the movement of a sign. So we can have something like impossible and New York State, where, again, the only thing that differs between those 2 signs is the movement that's used. The location where the sign is produced is another kind of distinction here. So the sign onion and the sign key, again, identical except for location. And the orientation of the palm is another factor. So we can have the sign want and the sign freeze. Right? And so he theorized that in fact this kind of structure was playing the same sort of role in the organization of the linguistic system that the phonological structure, those little sound units, were playing in the organization of spoken language. And this was kind of a watershed moment in the history of sign language linguistics. In fact, one could argue that this insight was what birthed the field of sign language linguistics, when we started to understand that maybe even in a different modality, the same kinds of organizational principles are at work. So because we have structure like this, we're going to say that sign language passes the discreteness test. Maybe it doesn't really matter that these things be organized in a linear sequence as long as they exist within the system. And in fact, this has now sort of caused a feedback effect and influenced the way that we view spoken language phonology. There's a big movement now looking at nonlinear phonology, which I like to think was inspired, at least in part, from these insights on sign language. Okay, the next feature is called duality of patterning. And this is a little bit, it's very similar to discreteness, but the key bit is has a bit of a different emphasis. So we've talked about the idea that words and signs are composed of these smaller units that get recombined. The idea about duality of patterning is that there are 2 levels of organization. At one level, there is a meaningful unit that actually refers to some concept, some notion, some meaningful thing. But that is made up of these meaningless bits. Right? So in the same way that we can think of the word stop, it has a meaning, but that meaning is not really just a linear sum of the meanings of s, t, ah, and p. Right? So, as another example, we have words like hope, wish, desire. Right? Those all have very similar meanings, but their form, their phonemes, their sounds are completely different. Likewise, we have words like cat, act, and tack that have completely different meanings, even though they're just rearranging the same sounds. This is what it means to have duality of patterning. So we have this inventory of units that we are going to build words out of, but the meanings of the words that we build do not depend on the units out of which they are built. Does that make sense? So now let's ask whether signs that share phonological parameters, so things like hand shape, movement, location, orientation, We call those phonological parameters in sign. We're going to ask this, whether signs that have similar phonological parameters also share meaning. So, and again, do I still have any signers in the room, or still no? Okay. So let's, all of these signs share this handshake. So we have red, etc., dream, ugly. Okay? Totally different meanings, all with this unit. Likewise, now we have this handshake. We have cute, bacon, hurricane, funny. Okay? And notice now if we go sort of vertically pairwise, we have red and cute. So these share everything except the handshake. We have etc. and bacon. We have, I don't know why I put dream and hurricane there. That's not really a minimal pair, dream and hurricane. And then ugly and funny both being produced at the nose. We can ask the same thing about movement. So we have signs like chair, impossible, umbrella, name. All with a sort of repeated up and down double tap motion. No meaningful relationship at all. We also have movements like temporary, back and forth, subway, commute, erase. So you get the point. You do the same thing with locations like onion, annoying, nephew, lettuce. Or down here we have key, you can have medicine, you can have butter, you can have rake. And we can, yeah, book, thing, boat, new, you get the point by now. And then if I just flip one hand over, paper, cheese, movie, school. Okay. So, much as in the same way that we find that we can rearrange the same spoken language units into different combinations that don't share meaning, we can do the same thing in signs by recombining and rearranging these units of handshake, location, movement, and orientation. Any questions on anything so far? I've been talking a lot. I usually like to have a little more interaction. All right, I will take your word for it. By the way, I'm hoping, I'm planning to leave actually a good chunk of time at the end of the lecture for questions, because when I've spoken about this stuff before, lots of people have really good questions and curiosities about how sign language works and what all these things are. So my hope is that we will get through this material and then we can chat a bit about the kinds of stuff that you guys are curious about. All right, duality patterning part 2. So what we've found so far is that meaningless sublexical units, again, sublexical just means smaller than a word. Meaningless sublexical units combine to form signs. Great. But is there structure at any more complex level? We know that in spoken languages, there's much more to spoken languages than just a big bag of words. So in English, there are ways of combining words and these other units that are called morphemes. Have you guys talked about morphemes? Good. There are sort of word formation rules in English that let you combine, for example, a verb and then this kind of stem, ation, or sometimes just ion, and that combination turns the verb into a noun. So we have, for example, the verb locate becomes location, suspend becomes suspension, prepare becomes preparation, and this is a fairly productive process in English. If I made up a novel verb, dax, you could say that this is a daxation, right? So the question is, does ASL do something like this? Anything like this? And as you may have guessed by now, the answer is yes. So we have the verb eat. If you repeat that movement, it now means food. It acts, this is a verb, this is a noun. Likewise, we have the verb sit, and you've already seen what it looks like when sit is repeated. That means chair. We have call, but if that motion turns into a double tap, it means phone. There are other processes like this in ASL. The agentive suffix is another one. So this is the verb teach, and this is a morpheme that means person, and teach person is a teacher, right? Worker, student actually is derived from the verb learn, person, student. So sign language, once again, passes the duality patterning test, both at the level of individual signs, the components that combine to form the meanings of the signs, as well as putting these more meaningful units together, combining morphological principles that turn verbs into nouns, etc. So now we get into some more sort of what I think of as the fun and interesting stuff. Learnability was another of Hockett's criteria. This is the idea that speakers of one language must be able to learn to speak another, and, importantly, the system itself must be learnable by human infants. So this is actually, this is one of Hockett's insights that helps us understand why something like HTML or even music, one could say, don't really pass the tests in terms of human language. So if I just exposed a baby to HTML code and nothing else, sorry kid, like that kid is not going to grow up being able to communicate and have a human language like the rest of us do. He's not even going to make friends with the computer. It's just not going to work. So the fact that that languages have to be learnable by infants turns out to be a really important criterion. And this leads us to the question of whether sign language acquisition is like spoken language acquisition. So in speech, we know that there's an early period where babies aren't saying a whole lot, but they are attending to the environment around them. Babies are actually really good at picking up the difference between linguistic sounds and non-linguistic sounds. They tend to pay attention much more readily to the sounds of human language. Even early in the womb, some sound information about the spoken language is getting through to infants. People have done very cool experiments where, like, right after birth, they expose a child to the sort of patterns of their native language, the one that their mother has been speaking for the last 9 months, versus some unfamiliar language. And by looking at how much the infants suck on a pacifier, I think, or a finger, maybe it is, they show a reliable preference for the pattern that their mother has been speaking, suggesting that they've learned something even in the womb already. Now, obviously, that's not something that deaf babies can do, so maybe there are some differences here. But it turns out that actually, sign language acquisition proceeds very much on the same timetable as spoken language acquisition. So after this initial period where they're not saying very much, they're just kind of attending, soaking it all in, hearing babies babble with their mouths. Turns out deaf babies babble with their mouths too, part of exploring what your body does. But one thing that sign-exposed babies do, whether they're deaf or hearing actually, one thing that sign-exposed babies do is they babble with their hands. And hearing babies don't actually do this, unless they are sign-exposed hearing babies. Now, the babbling stage is sort of fairly disorganized initially, and then it becomes a little bit more organized, and then before long, you get to your first word, or in this case, your first sign. This young girl is signing the word mom. Mama, mama. An interesting generalization across like early words in children is that they are motorically and phonologically simple to produce. So signs for parents, caregivers around the world tend to be these very simple sort of consonant vowel sequences. And likewise in sign languages, they tend to be sort of uncomplicated, hand-shaped, simple movements, simple locations. And then, of course, after one sign, then you start getting sign combinations, you start getting sign point as early precursors of sort of subject-predicate kinds of patterns. And when babies are exposed to sign language from birth, this trajectory happens pretty much on the same time course as it happens in hearing babies who are learning a spoken language. One possible exception that you may have heard about are claims that the first sign is sometimes produced earlier than the first word in spoken languages. This turns out to be a complicated kind of claim. There is some evidence, there's biological sort of muscle development evidence that the nerves that innervate your hands and your arms develop a little bit faster than the nerves that innervate your vocal tracts. So you have better voluntary control over your hands a little bit sooner than you have voluntary control over all of your vocal tracts. But so that's a good reason to expect that maybe we should expect the first sign to come before the baby is ready, conceptually ready to figure out that, oh, things have names, and these are the names of things. But some of the research that has been published claiming that first signs come earlier has included points to things as signs. So like, what's the sign for nose? What's the sign for me? Right? Sometimes those get counted as signs, and it's not totally clear. Like, if a hearing kid does that, they don't count that as a first word. Right? So a little bit murky whether this actually happens earlier or not, but one thing is pretty clear, it does not happen any later. Questions? Okay, so sign language definitely passes the learnability test. I should mention with respect to part 1 here that yes, if you know a sign language, you can learn another language, you can learn another sign language, you can learn another spoken language. It works. Oh, that was supposed to come later. Traditional transmission is another one of Hockett's criteria. Now, when Hockett developed, the reason that he included this criterion is so that we could rule out any kinds of systems that were innate, that were completely, you could, as soon as an organism hatched or was born, you could remove it, put it in an isolated, sort of cage or something, and it would still spontaneously show native, sort of wild type communication behavior. Hockett observed that human language really is not like that. If you isolate a child that way, that child is really screwed up and does not come up with language. So it was important for Hockett to include this criterion that means in order to acquire this system, it has to be transmitted from one generation to the next. Now, this turns out to be a bit of a complication in sign languages, because on the previous slide I had that caveat, as long as babies are exposed to sign language from birth, then everything looks normal. The sad reality is that of all the babies who are born with severe to profound deafness, only about 5% of them get exposed to sign language from birth. So a lot of the research has focused on those 5% because that's the situation where things are most typical, most parallel to spoken language acquisition. But we have this whopping 95% of deaf kids who do not fit that profile. And so how do they learn? What is their experience like? Sometimes they can learn from parents if the parents get involved in parent-infant programs or early childhood intervention programs. But that's a lot more rare than I would like to see. The latest data I've seen are that about 75% of hearing parents do not use sign with their deaf babies. This is in contrast, sadly, ironically, to the rapidly rising trend of hearing parents using sign with their hearing babies. Really, really upsets me. So some of these kids learn sign when they enroll in school. So they are kindergarten, 5 years old, and they go to a school for the deaf that uses sign language, or they go to a program in a mainstream school with other deaf kids or interpreters. But they're 5 years old. There's a lot that a hearing 5-year-old should be able to do by then. Yeah.
Going back to the native quickly.
Yeah.
So you said that that's the situation where those kids are learning it from their parents.
That's right.
So going back to the 75% of the parents, the hearing parents who don't teach it to their deaf kids, that's the situation, the non-native, where they grew up and they went to sign language.
That's right. Yep, you got it. I don't want to be too harsh on the parents of these 95%, because those parents are folks like you guys, right? You could have a deaf child, and you don't already know ASL, and you don't know that you're going to have a deaf child until you have one. So, yes.
Is this including children that become deaf later in life?
No. These stats are computed with respect to, that's a good question. It is either prelingually deaf, which is generally defined as before the first year, or congenitally deaf, which means at birth they are screened. The quick sidebar, the way that hearing loss is diagnosed at least in the United States and many places around the world, every baby that's born is screened before he or she leaves the hospital with some very basic, non-invasive measures of electricity on the scalp in response to sound stimulation. We know what the typical profile looks like for that kind of activity. If a child doesn't show that kind of activity, they get referred to, or they don't like to call it a failure, because that's sort of for parents, with their newborn, oh, a failure. They refer them back for another visit at 6 months. If they don't show the typical profile again at 6 months, then they're referred to an audiologist, and then a whole lot of stuff happens. What was your question?
6 months is a long time, though.
6 months
Yeah.
is a long time. Yeah.
Because you'd wanna know so you could start learning sign language, like
You would
almost
think
right
so.
away.
Well, and they're already absorbing so much information, like visually by that point too.
That's what I'm saying. I think most of the parents, the 75% of parents who don't teach it, I just feel like they just don't realize, like, how much better it'll help the child if you teach it right from the start.
We will get
They
there.
probably think that,
Well,
okay,
We will get
I'm sure it's a lot more complicated.
yeah, obviously, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm very glad to hear you guys thinking along these lines, and it gives me hope for the next generation of deaf children. So let's move along. So on the basis of the 5%, we're going to conclude that yes, sign language passes the traditional transmission test. There's nothing inherently problematic about the system itself that causes it to fail this test. The 95 that don't get traditional transmission, it's not because of the language, it's because of the culture. Right? So the language itself passes. So now we get to the other 95%. And I'm glad that you'll indulge me in some digression here, because I like talking about this stuff a lot. So, one giant reason that the 95%, or I should say the 75%, who choose not to use sign, one main reason why they make that decision is because that's the advice that they get from their doctors and from the audiologists. So there are, broadly speaking, there are two ways to view deafness. There is a view that is very much a medical kind of perspective, that views it as you have a problem in one of your major senses, something is broken, we should fix it. Then you have another view on deafness, which is as a culture, a linguistic community, that says that being deaf is a cultural value, a cultural identity, that has its own values, its own language, its own literature, its own history. This creates a major clash. Part of the reason for that clash is that when babies are born, they are sort of by default sort of shunted into the medical world. Right? Babies are born in hospitals. And so the advice that parents get comes from professionals who are trained in understanding how the body works, understanding how hearing and ears work. They're not professionals who are trained in language acquisition, in linguistics, in cognitive development. So this kind of skews the emphasis of the information that parents get. There are laws on the books that whose language states that parents of newly diagnosed deaf infants are supposed to get unbiased information about the communication options available to them. This does not happen. The information that parents get is very much geared toward speech and spoken language, and they usually include like a sentence about sign. This also upsets me a lot. One of the reasons, well, this has been true for a long time, but one of the reasons that it remains true is due to the rise of cochlear implants. Just show of hands, how many people have at least heard of a cochlear implant? Yeah, okay. So I don't need to explain big picture, I can go straight to details. Cochlear implants serve some children very, very well. Some children do great, they perform at age level with their peers, but that is not always the case. In fact, anytime you go to a talk about cochlear implants at an academic conference, the first sentence is usually something like, although many children succeed with cochlear implants, outcomes are highly variable. And then the talk goes on to try to pursue try to understand some aspect of what's causing that variability. Question?
That's what I was gonna say, it's causing a variability.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so we're going to talk about that for just a bit. Briefly, you may already know what cochlear implants do is they convert acoustic energy, so the sound waves that are traveling through the air, they convert that into electrical signals that directly stimulate your auditory nerve. This is appropriate when the cause of hearing loss is the cochlea itself, which for most congenital sensorineural deafness, it is. I want to give you a sense of what these things sound like. So hopefully, oh, come on. I want you kind of secure, come on. Maybe. Or maybe we're just gonna freeze.
I actually knew a girl with cochlear implants pretty well. Like, it never bothered us, like, as her friends, but she was always very bitter. And she always, like, had a feeling, this might be, like, might have been just her, but she always had a feeling that, like, we were against her because she was deaf and that she couldn't hear very well. And, like, she would have to pass, like, a microphone a lot, like, to the, like, teachers and stuff like that because it was hard for her to hear with other distractions. And, like, it was really hard for her to hear, like, at a dining room table because there was so much input. She had to be, like, looking straight at you. And she liked to be in a corner so there's no, like, background noise.
Yeah.
And so it just caused, like, she did well in school, like, she went to, like, an Ivy League, and, like, learning was never, like, an issue, it was just, like, her own bitterness because she felt like the world was against her already.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, so that brings up another really important dimension that often gets overlooked in the research on cochlear implants, which is psychosocial development. Right? That even when spoken language acquisition is good, even when academic outcomes are good, there can be, really bothersome psychosocial consequences of having that. Now, it's also important to recognize that that is an anecdotal experience, and somebody else could have been sitting here whose friend had a cochlear implant and had a wonderful experience, and then we would all be likely to have a different view of things. So it's important to carefully, academically look at broad research trends, especially when we're trying to set social policy or medical evidence-based best practices. So in that pursuit, I want to play a sample of what this sounds like. They don't actually say how many channels are active in this particular simulation. Cochlear implants, the way they work is they have a bunch of different channels on this electrode. Usually 22 to 24 actual channels exist, but not all of them can be activated. Sometimes the user gets really overwhelmed, overstimulated, just even painful sometimes. So usually 8 channels are active in a typical implant. Now this contrasts with your natural cochlea, has roughly 22,000 channels, like basically frequency bands. So you're trying to sort of sort what would ordinarily be 22,000 different colors, for example, into a box of crayons that has 8 options. And here's what it sounds like. Okay, it doesn't sound like that. Volume control? Alright, I'm just going to crank it on my laptop. Good luck.
Sounds like the radio came in, like aliens were talking over it.
Anybody get any words out of that?
At the end
I
of
heard
5
family
minutes.
viewing, that's.
Family, oh, because it's there.
I was primed with it,
Interesting. So, and that is an exceptionally good insight. What that is called is top-down information. So when you know what to expect, you can pick up more out of the signal. So what I'm going to do now is I'll play you the normal sounding one, and then I'll play the simulation again, and you're going to hear way more in the simulation than you did before. Okay, So here's what it actually is saying.
The BBC would like to announce that the next scene is not considered suitable for family viewing. It contains scenes of violence involving people's heads and arms getting chopped off, their ears nailed to trees and their toenails pulled out in slow motion. There are also scenes of naked women with floppy breasts.
Oh, what was that?
This is Monty Python. All right, so here's what that sounds like through the CI. Right? So, I mean, who got more out of it the second time? Right? And in fact, if I just played that like 8 times in a row, or even if I hadn't shown you the normal sounding one, if I just kept playing that same recording over and over again, you would start to get it. Yeah?
So are you saying that the second one that you played is what a cochlear implant person would hear?
No. What I'm saying is that it is easy to convince people like us, who already speak English, that we can adapt to this kind of signal pretty clearly. It can come to sound pretty good to us because we already know the language. Right? And in fact, when adults become deaf late in life and they elect to get a cochlear implant, they often do very, very well because they already know the language. But that's not the challenge that's facing a young deaf children who is receiving a CI. No, this is not going to help. There we go. So imagine then trying to do this in a language that you don't know. Anybody speak German? So this simulation, to me, this sounds more like it has maybe 12 channels active. It's a little bit clearer. Deaf children who are trying to learn their first language on the basis of this input, they're facing a very different challenge than an adult or than someone like us listening to these, where we have already acquired the vocabulary, we've already acquired the grammar, we know how the system works. All we have to do is solve that perceptual mapping problem. A deaf child actually has to build up the whole system from scratch on the basis of that sort of noisy input. One more thing while I have the demo pulled up. Let me just play you what music sounds like. Anybody know what name that tune? Classical musical enthusiasts?
Beethoven Symphony?
I
Joy?
think, nope, it's not that one. I think it's Haydn's Water Music. Oh, stop. Come on. Right, so CIs.
So, I'm sorry, I'm a little confused.
Yes.
So you said that's not what a deaf person hears, or?
So, all right. Thank you for pushing on this. There's even 2 more distinctions that are worth making. The point that I was trying to make before is that our experience of being able to identify words and syntactic structure in that noisy signal, that is due to the fact that we as adult native English speakers have already done a lot of the hard work of learning. So even if an infant is perceiving that same acoustic experience, the sort of very same sound waves were being transmitted to electronic impulses and going into the auditory brainstem, their ability to extract meaningful linguistic information out of that is going to be much worse. There's a second, more subtle point that I wasn't going to go into, but since you brought it up, these really are just simulations. There's no really direct way to know exactly what a child is experiencing, also partly because every surgery is slightly different, right? And so the exact place along the auditory nerve where the electrodes fall is a little bit different. And so for that reason, kids have to go to an audiologist very regularly, usually every 6 months or so, for their whole life, to get what they call the mapping updated. So audiologists can sort of tune the implant to say, oh, okay, this bit sounds fuzzy to you. Okay, let's adjust that frequency down a little bit. Let's boost the amplitude in this range. And over time, you can improve what the implant will sound like. But in the end, you're sort of relying on their ability to tell you what's good and what's not.
And they have no, like, usually they don't have any, like, relation, like, relative, like, understanding, like, what sounds good and what sounds bad.
Yeah, if they're a child who has received an implant and has never experienced normal hearing, yeah. Adults with late onset deafness, they can tell you, like, oh yeah, that sounds tinny, can you turn down the high frequencies, right? I'll foreshadow a little bit. If a deaf child is a proficient signer, by the time when they get a cochlear implant, that kid also has a language with which to tell the parent or the audiologist, hey, not working, or this one up more, this one down. Right? If you don't have that linguistic foundation to communicate those things, it's going to be a lot harder to get your settings right. Oh gosh, now we are running out of time. Okay, I at least want to show you, I'm guessing that you guys have seen videos of kids or maybe adults getting their cochlear implants activated. These go around Facebook kind of a lot. They go around like BuzzFeed and whatnot. So this is one that gets passed around a fair bit. I'm not allowed to advertise alcohol to undergraduates, YouTube.
My boss says her daughter got her implant in her 20s. She never wears it.
Oops.
Yeah. No. Do you hear something? Hi. Oh, keep it on. It's on. Not anymore. Keep it on. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Alright, so right now I'm gonna drop him down since he did respond to that. Okay. Hey, good job. You're back on. I know. Hi, Cooper. Hi, Cooper.
Okay.
Quick question. So
Yes.
The implant is like, does it surgically go inside and it just has the node on the outside? Like how, what?
Yeah, good question. So the implant itself is an electrode that is completely internal. It's like way inside in your inner ear. The bit that's on the outside is a microphone and a speech processor, and that's what hangs behind the ear. And then the information that the speech processor takes in is transmitted via radio frequency to a receiver that is implanted like sort of back here, and that attaches with a magnet. And so that's the thing that you see them taking on and off is the speech processor and the transmitter.
But so to hear it all, you have to have that.
You have to have it connected. That's right. If you take that off, you're deaf. And in fact, the procedure of doing the surgery to put in the implant will destroy whatever residual hearing you might have in that ear. So usually kids who get implanted in their worst ear, and they leave the better one for acoustic processing.
Do people, surgeons, or like the woman that was saying hi Cooper and stuff, do they know sign language?
Usually not. Usually not at all. There are exceptions, good exceptions. Boston has a bunch of people who are an exception, but a couple of points I want to make about this video before we move on. So, one thing to notice is that when he's, she's saying, hi Cooper, what is he hearing?
He's just hearing. He's not hearing hi Cooper.
Precisely. He's hearing, he's like, something happened, something happened. And some kids have this great emotional happy reaction. Some kids have like really
terrified.
super terrified. Those videos don't tend to make it to YouTube or BuzzFeed or whatever.
Laugh. They're like, oh.
Right, so we see a biased sample of outcomes. The other point I want to make is that Cooper is 24 months old. 24 months old.
Good.
Benjamin Button. No, he's a 2-year-old kid. So this is what a typical 2-year-old. Oops. There we go. Everybody see my mouse?
No, I remember in the page.
There you go.
There we go. this is what a typical 2-year-old ought to be able to do.
Yay! Being Barney. I love you.
Oh, there's a cute bit. Alright, you get it, you get it. There's a funny bit somewhere in the end, but I don't want to spend the time to zoom to it. So, she can do a lot. And she's, I mean, the bit that I played you, because I didn't have it time synced correctly, is kind of routine. She's reciting these things, and obviously not entirely correctly. But there's a bit later where you can hear her say things like, "Daddy, nibble my ear." And so she has a lot of linguistic ability that Cooper can just make noises. He can't communicate, he can't respond the same way that she, like a typical 24-month-old, should be able to.
Yeah, he wasn't responding like in the way you would expect.
Yeah. So now let's take a look at Ava here, who is a BSL signer, growing up in a British deaf family.
The first to meet the clean air.
Can you read the captions there?
Can you make it big screen?
Okay, so you get the idea here. So his utterance is, a couple signs long. That's typical for a 2-year-old. But from the content of what Ava, she, I guess, from the content of those utterances, we can tell that Ava is tracking the conversation, responding appropriately, taking turns, and doing all of the sophisticated language behavior that you would expect from a hearing 2-month-old that somebody who has not had language for 2 years doesn't have. Yeah.
Could you say, or could you argue that it's a possibility if a child gets a cochlear implant instead of learning just sign language, that it's a possibility that there could be handicaps in in education?
Yes, you absolutely could. In fact, yes. Yes. The research that, well, okay, let me show you this graph and then we'll go on. This is the result of a longitudinal study of a bunch of deaf kids who've gotten cochlear implants. They're followed from age 6 months to age 8 years. So they're in like 3rd grade by the end of the study. The black line is the typical, hearing kids with no hearing impairment at all, is their typical performance on the language measures that they're studying here. This is language comprehension and language production. The pink dotted line is the predicted trajectory of a deaf child without an implant on these measures of speech, language, and speech, speech comprehension and speech production. And the difference here is if you get an implant after you're 3 years old, between 18 months and 3 years old, and before 18 months. Okay. The lines with color represent individual trajectories of deaf kids with cochlear implants. The solid colored line is the average of those kids. And this research got a lot of praise, and people were very, very excited about this because the solid color line is above the pink line. And it is more above it here than it is here. And here it is not above the pink line at all. So people got really, really excited about this because it suggested that if you implant earlier, you're going to do much, much better than if you had not implanted at all. What,
Does this take into consideration kids speaking sign at native level?
these are all kids who don't sign at all.
Okay.
What nobody seems to be very upset about, at least nobody who publishes in this literature, is that difference. Right? There's a huge gap between, even in the sort of best case scenario, there's a huge gap between typical hearing performance, which you can see is really not variable, and the average performance of deaf kid. Yes, there are some who perform way up in here. There absolutely are, and good on them. But there's all these kids here who are like, these kids are all depending on this implant for their only language. So I think we should be upset, or at least disturbed or cautious about these efforts. But that's enough of my soapbox. We should get back to the lecture. So another thing to point out is that children with cochlear implants, they don't just acquire language in the same way that we do. They actually have to go through years of pretty intense speech therapy in order to learn it. And most don't have any other language to fall back on if that doesn't work. So speech actually fails the learnability test for deaf kids with CIs, I would argue. Late learners, so this is now the question of, okay, so what happens when a deaf child, maybe they try a CI and it fails, then they get exposed to sign language late in life. It turns out that there's this notion of a critical period, which means that there's sort of a certain window during which your language learning outcomes will be best, will be optimal, and after that, you're not going to do all that well. So what these data show us is that these are two groups of deaf, these are adults actually, but who had different language experience as children. These ones grew up hearing and lost their hearing at some point, and then learned ASL. These guys were born deaf, but not exposed to ASL. They were matched on their age at which they were exposed to ASL. So if somebody here was 5 years old the first time that they were exposed, they found someone who had lost their hearing at 5 and started learning to sign then. What they found is this huge impact of having some early exposure to a language that helped, so English helped them learn ASL, basically, compared to not having anything. Over here, they did the same, used the same kind of measures to look at people's ability to learn English. So here they had 3 groups. These guys were hearing bilinguals, so they had immigrated to the US, say they immigrated at 5, they grew up speaking, I don't know, Pashto, and then started learning English. These guys were born in deaf families, so they grew up with an early sign language and then started learning English. And then these guys were born deaf into hearing families, no sign until they started learning English. And once again, we find that the group that lacked any early language exposure is doing poorly, but the group that had early sign looked just the same as the group that had some other spoken language.
So the early sign was people who could hear, but their family was deaf, so they were just exposed to sign language early and then lost it?
Good guess, but no. In this case, these were measures of written English, reading and writing. And so these were all deaf adults who had been born into deaf families. So these results are not measuring speaking and listening, they're measuring reading and writing. But we should move on. You guys have already talked about home signs, so I'm going to skip that. I'm going to mostly skip this, except to make a plug for the class that I'm offering in the fall, which looks at, in part 1, we're looking at the question of how human beings how our language capacity evolved in the first place. And in part 2, we're going to look at how new sign languages evolve around the world today. So if you haven't taken, if you need another class or this sounds cool, it's only 1 day a week. That happens to be Monday mornings. It's not great. I don't like it either, but it's a deal. So email me if you're interested. So let's recap before we have to go. What we've learned is that, okay, there were some initial criteria where sign languages failed, Hockett's proposal for what a language needs to be. But on the rest of them, it passes with flying colors. So maybe actually what we need to do is revise the definition that Hockett proposed and say that maybe these things aren't really crucial factors for human language. And in that sense, understanding how sign works really revises our understanding of what human language is like. So we know that sign languages are full natural languages, and this also has important implications. This understanding of what sign language is and what it can offer, I think, has important implications for medical and educational policy. But please feel free to email me. I can also, we're out of class time. I'm happy to take the question, but I can hang out here for a few minutes unless another class is beating down the door. Take my class and ask if you want.
I just have like a quick question. Does ASL limit schooling? Because not everyone can sign language. And what about work and things like that?
Great question. So the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in the 1990s, and it called for children to be educated in what's called the least restrictive environment. The spirit of the law was good. It wanted children with various kinds of disability to not be institutionalized to the extent possible, to sort of have social experiences with typically developing kids. It turns out, though, that language is a big deal. Language is a big deal in education. And so what it means to be a least restricted environment, for a deaf kid, that might mean a school that is assigning school. It's a very contentious issue. And then for work, the Americans with Disabilities Act does require employers to not discriminate against deaf individuals, provided that providing accommodation does not constitute an undue hardship on the business, and as long as hearing is not a necessary part of fulfilling the job duties.
So it's definitely because you need a translator.
Yep, and so that is usually, for a large corporation, that is a reasonable accommodation. For example, the current receptionist at the White House, I don't know if you guys know this, she is deaf. The receptionist of the United States right now is a deaf woman who has an interpreter, and she handles all the Obama's meetings and schedules and everything, all in sign.
Isn't she from a Berkeley or something?
I don't know where she's from.
My sister's from Berkeley.
Leah Katzman. Question?
I was just gonna say, I shadowed a speech pathologist, and one of the students had an interpreter go through with all her classes. But then I was thinking, what happens when you go to college? If you're still gonna have that, or is there a specific college that?
There are a couple, so there are a lot of deaf students at typical colleges get interpreters supplied by the university. There are a couple colleges, so Gallaudet University, as well as the National Technical University for the Deaf, our classes are, the courses are all offered in sign, and most of the students and faculty sign. There are other options.
I'm just curious about your personal opinion, for people find out they have babies and found out the babies are deaf, what do you think, in your opinion, should be the first step, get all the information and have them decide whether they want to do the implants or not, or at least try the implants, and if it doesn't work, what do you believe should be?
Yeah, so this is a combination, I guess, of personal and a professional opinion.
Yeah.
I don't think that implants constitute a threat themselves. I think that withholding access to sign does. And so I think the first step is to make sure that the parents are going to get involved in a parent-infant program in some sort of way that both the parents and the child are going to be able to learn ASL in this country. And then I'm not opposed if they want to do the surgery. I think go ahead and do it. We actually don't, so we know that age of implantation matters if the child is not being exposed to sign. We actually don't even know if age of implantation matters as much when the child already has a native language to learn. But I would probably go ahead and do the surgery. It's not that, it's a surgery, it's a risk, it's anything. But to me, it's, in the support of bilingualism, I think it's fine. I would not at all hang all of my hopes on my child's only language on speech to an
Right, and actually, in terms of bilingual, would you say that it's easy, so the child does get this, and you're also teaching the sign language, and also trying to actually learn English, so it might be more difficult, the same difficult as the kid who's hearing, who knows English, but is trying to learn another language. You think
That was the
it's actually
pilot.
the same ability?
That was
Yeah, I
the
think that's
pilot.
part of what we see
Else mine is
from-
gone, whatever. Your else mine is gone too, so.
Parts of what we learned from.
No, she said that in the email, yeah.
Yes.
Well, aside from learning vocabulary and grammar and stuff, they also have to learn how to hear the sounds and differentiate between the sounds. You take that for granted.
we already know to differentiate.
Yeah.
Because we figured that out between the ages of 8 and 10 months.
Yeah, and it's already like so late by then. That's why my boss's daughter doesn't, or like my coworker's daughter, like would take it out. It's just like, it was too much at 20 to like
Mhm.
learn.
Mhm. Yeah,
Good luck, Jane.
thanks.
Thank you, have a nice one.
Okay, sure. It's the same one as Dr. Kalen's. Do you know what that is?
No.
Oak 355.
Okay, thank you. I'll be right back.
Okay,
Do you teach sign language?
I don't.
Oh, okay, so you won't. I showed, the other professor, two of my cousins' work, American Sign Language.
The American School for Deaf, yeah.
Yeah, and one of them, she got one of her videos posted on, it was the newspaper for Boston.
Oh.
And, but it was on like YouTube. She teaches sign language for cats.
Oh,
And-
yeah, I
Oh,
saw
you
that.
seen it?
Yeah, I've
That's
seen
my
that.
cousin.
Oh, okay, cool. Cool.
So yeah, and I think that's why that girl came from Connecticut, because my family's been posting because they met her.
Oh,
So
cool.
I think she went to that school.
Nice, okay. Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Have fun taking time next semester.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.